Thanks so much for inviting me to this very interesting conference that engages the Newtown experience. I'm Ann Forsyth, and today I'm going to look at the broad picture of the 20th century legacy and 21st century future of new towns. New towns, as we know them today, really emerged as a response to industrialization and urban growth, going through what Wakeman calls an international golden age in the middle of the 1940s through the 1970s. Since the early 2000s, they've re-emerged in China, India, and parts of Africa in particular. And new towns, or new town style planning, is poised to be relevant for a number of coming challenges. New towns are not a panacea. They're very difficult to pull off, and there are many, many underwhelming examples, but there are relevant lessons for the current period. The talk draws on research I've done over the past 30 years, studying new towns on most continents, but particular work on the broad sweep of new towns in the last century. Of course, this requires one to define new towns, and like many others, I've focused on their being large, comprehensive, and new. They are places where most of life can be conducted. There are difficulties with this definition, however. For example, how large is large? Can they include large-scale redevelopments? So the definitions are complex. But just to help us center our thinking about this experience, I'd like you to think of a well-known new town from the 20th century. I'm imagining you are thinking of something that's internationally famous, the kind of new towns that form the common language of planners and designers. What I imagine you have thought of is a mixture of different types. Some will be classic early 20th century new towns and garden cities, represented here by Letchworth, north of London, started as a non-profit. Others will have imagined mid-20th century new towns, in this case, Vällingby, outside Stockholm in Sweden, or ones like Reston in the United States, outside Washington, DC, one of the private new towns in that country. And while most of the images in the lecture are mine, this is one of Alexander Garvin's from the 2021 New Towns book I co-edited with Rick Pizer. And of course, there may be those of you thinking about the very end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. This is Songjiang outside Shanghai, which was actually started in this current century, not the 20th. And the image is from 2011, showing how fast these new towns were developed in China, something I'll talk about as the instant new town. We may also have personal favorites that are more obscure. One of my favorites is Cumbernauld in Scotland, and another is Jamshedpur in India, both mid-century. But the well-known ones are a common language in planning and design. For the 2021 book with Rick Pizer, we created an inventory of over 500 new towns started in the 20th century and reaching 30,000 by 2015. I'd like to also thank Adam Tanaka for his help on this. This is a chart of these new towns with countries of five or more starts, again reaching 30,000 by 2015. So only the countries that had a large number of larger new towns. By far, the majority of these new towns in the 20th century were in Russia. And as I'll show later, there was a high period of such Russian new town development in the early part of the 20th century. The vast majority of these were for industrial development purposes. And indeed, roughly half the total inventory had a purpose of economic development. These included industrial, military, and research towns. And of course, often places had multiple rationales, but it's striking how much employment and industrial development mattered. It's also hard to know how finely crafted these Russian new towns were. Many were likely grim, but there were lots of them. As you can see, other countries also had large programs, including the US, where they have been generally privately developed, only occasionally with some government support. In the US case, most of them were for metropolitan deconcentration, by which we meant they were to provide a planned alternative to urban sprawl. But as you can see, there are many places that have had new towns in the 20th century: China, India, the UK, Japan, Singapore, Israel, Korea, and so on. This slide starts to unpack the 20th century experience and also the first part of the 21st century in the bottom bar. On the left is the total number of new towns in the inventory, and on the right are the countries with the most new town starts, when there was somewhere with at least 5 in that decade. So top to bottom, in green, you can see how important the Russian new town experience was in the early period. And indeed, if you look at Russia and the Eastern Bloc, including their technical assistance to places like China and India, they had a very large influence. Looking at the blue section, you can clearly see the golden period of the mid-century. And indeed, when I started research for my 2005 book on the US new towns of Irvine, Columbia, and Woodlands, I actually framed that research as looking at these new towns as early examples of smart growth and sustainable development approaches. When I told people I was doing that work, which I started in 1999, they would say, well, why bother to look at new towns? No one builds them anymore. And I actually replied and said, yes, that's right, but they have planning strategies worth studying. Of course, at that time in 1999, 2000 and after, the recent boom was just starting, but it was not yet obvious. And finally, the orange section shows the start of the Chinese expansion. And again, of the nearly 50 new towns in the bottom orange bar, it only includes those that had reached a population of 30,000 by 2015. So if we took a later date, there would be many more now. And as you can see from the bottom gray bar, this century is experiencing a new golden age or a second boom. Finally, on the inventory, I just want to show you the golden age and new golden age. And I want you to focus less on the absolute numbers and more on the diversity and location of new towns. And these are new towns with populations over 30,000 by 2015 and countries with 5 or more starts in a decade. And the story you can see is that with each decade from the 1940s to the 1970s, there were more and more diverse countries with substantial numbers of new towns spread around the world. And then after the economic changes of the 70s, there was a dramatic drop before they rise again, most notably in the first decade of this century in China. But since then, diversifying to more places. Before ending this section of the inventory, I need a caveat. This image is from the small nitrate extraction town of Maria Elena in Chile from a chapter in the New Towns book by Felipe Correa. And it's here to remind us that the charts I've just shown you are not the whole picture. There are many smaller developments that also form the new town history, where the freestanding towns like this one, or what one might call new town style neighborhoods, with design features associated with new towns, but not the comprehensive balance of uses. There is a rich history beyond the inventory. So having looked at the 20th century legacy, I want to briefly examine the rationales behind this history before moving on towards looking at the future. And the image here on the slide is from what I said was one of my favorite new towns, Jamshedpur in India. So first, in terms of benefits, were a set of economic and demographic goals. Given the alternative, which was often sprawl, could populations be channeled to better locations that could help economic development? Some of this movement was to satellites of major cities, and others were completely new areas, but these were sort of larger scale rationales. From the urban planning perspective, there are even more perceived benefits: urban patterns, balanced uses, social goals, efficient development, saving costs, innovative planning and design. And for businesses and governments, they could deliver on specific priorities, including such things as nation building. And so for these reasons, people tried new towns around the globe. But the new town experiment was not always successful. Here you can see a slide from a place that remains a favorite of mine as a new town, but had its troubles, Cumbernauld in Scotland. It was often hard to achieve the benefits proposed, and actually many places didn't even get off the ground. It was really hard to start. It's hard to find land and resources, and development would spread over years and face challenges with changing political and economic contexts. Encouraging people to come to a new place was not always easy. Often people would move to new towns with really high hopes for their social character, and they would be disappointed. There's a term called new town blues. And with a big new town, it can be hard to have diversity as many similar people move in at once. And then it can be also hard to promote interaction. And finally, new towns can have a number of problems related to their planning and design. For instance, design can be way too experimental, not something that people really want to live with. Governments can be difficult, balancing coordination and participation. And there can be problems like a lack of affordable housing, given all the housing is new. So they're not a panacea. So what does that mean for the future? And here you can see an image from a development in Angola showing Chinese engagement in the current century, something highlighted in a chapter in our book by Keynote and Provost. And so when I'm talking about these new towns remaining relevant, there are two main areas: how new towns engage with the changing urban context, and whether styles of new town development can be enlarged to suit better the current century. So obviously there are a lot of current urban problems that development needs to face. They are broadly about growth, environments, social and economic issues, and new technologies. New towns with their focus on innovation are well placed to engage this. And new towns can help focus development away from hazardous areas. They have potential, although it's unrealized, to house some of the coming waves of climate refugees in a more efficient way with better quality of life. And they can also perhaps be models for dealing with demographic shifts like aging by providing more service and housing options. One example of engaging with a contemporary issue is planned retreat that Rick Pizer and I have continued to work on after the book. As you know, in climate change adaptation, places can try to protect existing development. They can accommodate the change, for example, by raising development, or they can retreat away. And retreat comes in a number of forms, including having a whole community move away, either proactively or after a disaster. Retreat is not always a great solution and can lead to problems like climate sprawl as people try to find cheaper areas. It can lead to climate gentrification as people bid up prices in attractive existing areas. And generally, it can lead to social disconnection as communities are divided. So new towns could be a plausible solution. In contrast, the slide on the left is not of planned retreat, but of a new town being actually built in a low elevation zone. So there are lots of ways to retreat, but the new community experience can help with two of them. One is going to be rare, which is when an existing settlement moves as a whole, keeping social and economic ties intact. There are examples after disasters or in the face of dam construction, though they tend to be small and involve more rural areas. The other, on the right side of the slide, is for new towns to take people from many places. They won't keep social ties intact, but they can avoid the problems of climate sprawl and climate gentrification. There are lots of lessons from the past century for making these better places. However, again, there are likely to be new neighbourhoods rather than very large developments, as large developments are hard to do. A second way to think about the future is not about topics, but about new town planning styles. And to date, there have been two main types of development: sort of slowly developed comprehensive new towns, and the more instant new towns that have happened quite quickly, either because they were small or because of substantial government influence, as in China. But there are a number of emerging forms of planning, including maturation planning of new towns, balancing what they are now with their initial vision, the idea of new towns as infrastructure. This would be a way of having a more comprehensive set of infrastructure and letting people build out residential areas. And finally, a continuation of new town style neighbourhoods, drawing on the additional lessons we've had in the last few decades for how to do better urban development. So now you know something of the large 20th century legacy of new towns, with this golden age in the 40s through the 70s and a current second boom. I've discussed the rationales and objections to new towns, and I want to say there are many failed new towns in the world, but the ones that have gone forward do provide us some lessons. And I think they will never be the majority of development, but their lessons can be useful beyond the new towns themselves. And new forms of new town planning, such as thinking about maturation and infrastructure, can expand that influence.